rock-cut tomb, and they hear this from these two guys who just showed up out of nowhere. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Jesus told you he would get himself killed, but rise again a few days later. He's alive and he's not here. Returning to the 11 apostles, still carrying the fragrant spices with which to prepare Jesus' body for permanent burial, the women told what they saw and heard. The apostles thought they sounded crazy and hysterical. But Peter's curiosity got the better of him, and he went to the tomb and saw only the linen cloth Jesus had been wrapped in it. That phrase, and it comes out of the middle of the passage, why are you looking for the living among the dead, turned out to be kind of an earworm for me. You know what an earworm is, right? It's usually related to a piece of music that gets stuck in your head. Usually it's a bad piece of music. Okay, for me it always had been jingles. Bad jingles. Why do you look for the living among the dead? This was a good earworm, because it really got me thinking. Now the expectation the women who had come to the tomb had, the women who come to prepare Jesus' body for permanent burial, in the Jewish custom of the day, you would anoint the body with fragrant herbs and an olive oil based ointment, before you wrapped it in its final wrap to be buried in. Their expectation was the obvious and very logical one. Jesus, who died on the cross, was dead and in the tomb. You know, what do you expect when someone's dead? Well, they're dead. Pause up. Done. But this isn't the way things worked out. You see, Jesus had promised something different. He promised resurrection. Now, you know, we tend to think that, well, how could they then not understand that? And why were they confused about Jesus not being in the tomb? Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of Jewish background here. For the Jews of that period, the idea of resurrection was one that kind of was working its way into their religious culture, but not everyone accepted it. And their notion was that there would be what's called a general resurrection at the end of the age, when God would raise all the faithful up. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. It would be much later. So they didn't expect, no matter what Jesus said, that he was anything but dead. It was a crushing disappointment, especially for the folks who followed him. He turned out to not be the Messiah that they hoped for, the one that was going to liberate Israel and restore them to prominence as the people that stood at the center of the universe with God. Knowledge and wisdom, common sense, expectation, everything that formed what we now call worldviews and paradigms and all that kind of stuff, said that he's dead and it's done. The women at the tomb and the apostles, they had their biases, their expectations that prevented looking for Christ anywhere but among the dead. So that's why it's so crazy to have someone say to them, why are you looking for the living among the dead? Living? Who? What? Of course, for us and for the church to whom Luke was writing at the time, both of us live on this side of the resurrection. Okay, it's already happened. So this question takes on a little different meaning. It takes a different twist for us. It really brings up a lot of interesting questions about, well, salvation, because that's really what all this is supposed to fall under. This idea of salvation. You know, we see that today. We don't call it that so much, but boy, we look to be saved. Mostly from stuff in our lives that's out of control. You know, it's interesting. There's always this phenomenon, and we've all seen it, where some big disaster occurs, and then all of a sudden the churches fill up, right? And it's people seeking answers to questions and something that saves them, if at least in the sense that it provides some kind of answer to what, why, where do we go from here? And I think we're seeing that now, but it's a longer, drawn-out kind of situation. We have a shattered economy that's only now beginning to pick up its own pieces, right? And people are still wondering how they're going to get by. That's why the news that we heard of, that Frank gave, of someone finding a full-time job. You know, we wouldn't have thought of this just years ago, right? 5 years ago, who would have thought the news of someone getting a full-time job was a big deal? It's just what we all did. Now, it's amazing stuff. We have a government by and for the people that can't govern. You know how frustrated that is for folks? It's amazing. We have the increased stress from increasing speed and complexity of life. How many people feel like everything is moving slowly and comfortably enough that we all feel like in our minds and souls? Yeah, you know, that all sounds crazy. We have, you know, as we grow older, we find we're more visited by illness and the failings of age. You know, pick your favorite anxiety. These are the kinds of things that we seek to be saved from, or at least to have questions answered or comfort given for, strength given for. The problem is that too often we seek our salvation from what can't heal and nurture. We look for the living among the dead, whether it's money and possessions. I have to admit that I'm a bit guilty of leaning on, what do they call it now? What is it? Shopping therapy or something like that? What's that? Retail therapy.
Oh, really?
It'd be better if it was wholesale therapy, because then it'd be a little cheaper. But yeah, retail therapy, you know? It may be alcohol, drugs, porn, gambling, or any of a number of other kinds of addictions that we seek some kind of salvation through. Escape. You know, I've always said that one of the reasons that television is often so bad. How many people think that television is the bright spot in our culture? Okay? Now, I'm not just panning television in general, but there's a lot of nonsense out there. How many people are big fans of, like, the Jersey Shore? You get the picture sometimes, right? Real Housewives of Name Your City. The reason this stuff is out there is because we buy into it in mass, and it's escapism. That's another place where we look for something. There's always quick fixes that we jump to. If you're sick, especially if you're very sick now, there is what I call, by all means, necessary medicine. You know, the kinds of heroics that we expect doctors, nurses, and hospitals will do for us if we're sick. By any means necessary to save us. Which, you know, maybe they can save our bodies, but they certainly can't heal us. That is too often looking for the living among the dead. There is close to and dear to my heart is empty spirituality and religion. that promises some easy spiritual fulfillment, but can't really answer any of the big questions. A lot of us escape through work, don't we? You know, that's where we look to find our fulfillment, our salvation. Sometimes it's gratification through inappropriate relationships, and I think I'm just going to leave that one right there. All these things are diversions that sort of suck the life out of us. It's places that we look to be for saving things in our life that just are things that are among the dead. We look everywhere, but to the one who beats death. Now, having ministered to dying and disabled persons, this idea of looking for the living among the dead really becomes sharply focused, I think. When the human condition of brokenness is most pronounced, you know, the question always comes up, where can we find wholeness and healing and peace and life? Where do we find life for the dying? I was confronted with this just recently as I was with someone who was very, very sick. And these questions became very important all of a sudden. Nothing that we tend to turn to in this world seems to help. When the corner's been turned and there's nowhere to go but down the path to the tomb. So where do we look for the living if we don't want to walk amongst the dead? Now here's where Easter could be made very cheap, and I could get away with doing the easy thing here. There's lots of good slogans and platitudes to offer. Oh, Jesus is the answer. Jesus saves. He is risen, and that makes all the difference. You know, I could just stop right there, you know, and that would probably be what you'd expect for Easter. Or I could give you some really bad theology and say, well, you know, if you're just faithful, God will answer all your prayers. If you believe in Jesus, your problems will be solved. One of my favorites, name it and claim it. God wants you to be wealthy and healthy. People seriously buy into this.
Amen.
Yeah. Not getting better. Well, then God means to bring you home soon. Ooh, that one bothers me because that forces God to be good and bad at the same time. If we're going to find the good news of what this day is about, we have to answer a question, and it's a hard one. So what if Jesus rose from death 2,000 years ago? How does that help the suffering and dying and us in this world now? Okay, to tackle that problem, I have to step back just for a minute, and we've got to talk about what God did through Jesus from a larger perspective. The big problem that God had, and it occurs early in the Bible, okay, all the way back to Genesis 3, is how does He break the grip of evil and sin on us and reconcile us to Himself? Well, there were several solutions that were tried. One of them was to simply obliterate evil and sin by destroying everything under its power in the world. That was what happened with the flood. Remember the whole Noah story? They thought he was crazy, you know, and then when it never stopped raining, that was the flood. The problem with this is it doesn't work. It didn't work. And it didn't work for two reasons. One, if there had been a completely clean sweep, then the very creation that God wanted to save, us, would have been gone. So obviously that's not a good solution. That's a little like curing cancer by shooting the patient. The other reason it didn't work is it wasn't a completely clean sweep. Yeah, Noah was a good guy. His family were all upright and whatnot, but boy, you can't speak for your kids, can you? Okay, the other solution that was attempted was to set rules and put us on the honor system to live up to them. That was this whole Mosaic law system that has as its opening its opening passage, the Ten Commandments. Now, this is a great idea. Lay down some rules, and we'll just do the right thing. Well, and this will work great as long as everyone always does the right thing. Now, how many people here think that that is likely to happen for more than about, 15 minutes? Not me. Evil and sin are just too strong to resist. They're just too seductive to deny, which is why we still have trouble with them now. Well, anyway, God decided that there's a better way to deal with this and a more permanent way to deal with this, and I call this God's gambit. He's going to solve the problem from the inside out. So what does he do? He inhabits humanity as Jesus. He takes on human frailty and vulnerability by being born into this world as Jesus. Or as Paul puts it in the 2nd chapter of Philippians, he emptied himself by taking the form of a slave and becoming like human beings. Emptied himself. Now, this does two things. It causes God to fully identify with who we are and the situation and the sufferings and everything else, the joys and the sufferings and everything that we're about. So this is one of the really cool things about God, is God knows exactly what it's like to be human because he's been here. The other thing that this does is this makes him a real tasty target for evil. Because up to this point, God is simply untouchable. So what he does is he goes on and he lets evil win the earthly battle. The battle down here by just dying. But in the process, he wins the cosmic battle, the one that really matters, by overcoming death and putting evil in its place and breaking that hold of sin onwards. And what's more, he offers us a share in that death, in that becoming alive again. Now, why do I call this a gambit? Well, I think it was risky for God to take human weakness upon himself, because it's human weakness that got us into all this mess in the first place. And the big question is, okay, Jesus does fine all the way up to the cross, but would we respond and accept the fruit of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, that fruit being forgiveness and reconciliation with God, and would we also accept the fruit of his resurrection, new life and freedom from sin's power, if offered to us? I want to share with you something that some of you folks have probably already read this, because I wrote this for the newsletter, but it seems so appropriate now. So let me share probably the first and only time I've ever written a piece of poetry. Way before you and I had a name, a penniless Jewish preacher, prophet, and professor of the deepest truth was nailed to a cross for insisting that the world didn't have to be as it was. Hanging high, he died. Dead as roadkill, lifeless as a stone. Death is like a casino. The house always wins. But the bets were all wrong this time. The house of death lost its sure thing. It couldn't even rig the tables to win. For way before you and I had a name, a penniless Jewish preacher, prophet, professor of the deepest truth, and very dead victim of our worst violence, refused to stay dead. Shaking off death's cold grip as if its fingers were as frail as dried twigs, with the morning, a garden with an empty tomb silently shouts, he's alive. So what? So what? Was it so large and loud that we missed it? Or were we so distracted by our disbelief, apathy, and lack of vision that we couldn't see? God's Son changed all the rules of sin we refuse to announce. Break all the chains of death we won't let go of. For way before you and I had a name, God's Son, Messiah, Emmanuel, God with us, gave death a holiday and sent sin packing. He chose life. And the good news echoed across the universe. Whatever it is that's broken, it doesn't have to be this way. For 1 billion starving people living on less than $1 a day, folk otherwise like you and and me, it doesn't have to be this way. For the hapless and homeless, hungry and hurting wanderers on the fringes of civilization, too uncivilized to treat them with dignity, it doesn't have to be this way. For the rich, blinded by the glitter of all their gold, but burdened by the anxiety that it's not enough, it doesn't have to be this way. For politicians who could be leaders, but can't muster the heart to lead, whose vocabulary is limited to labels, and who choke us with sound bites, it doesn't have to be this way. To a world wounded by violence, the cold, calculated violence of national interest, the cold, calculated violence of terrorist rage, the cold, calculated violence of a lone murderer of children in a New England school on a winter's morning. It doesn't have to be this way. For the wounded, sick, disabled, and dying, blinded by their own beauty. Ready to retire and become the walking dead long before they take their place at heaven's banquet table. It doesn't have to be this way. For a church who can't see past its own traditions and comfortable habits, to hear God's call to new ways, to offer the good news again with a child's eagerness, as if it were the first time, it doesn't have to be this way. It will. So, go from this place on this Easter day to wherever it is you're going to be, knowing that Christ has died, but Christ has risen. And that means everything is very good. So go be blessed and be a blessing this Easter. Amen.